Chapter 3. Adian. A fortuitous meeting. Adian's lungs ached. His legs and shoulders burned. He pulled a cart laden with two blood-drenched people. The moans that escaped their lips combined with his own rhythmic grunts of exertion to create a marching dirge. He didn't know what to do. He had arrived at the old farmhouse in time to drive off a group of rat-gore with his sonic boom skill and save the two farmers' lives. He had not, however, arrived soon enough to stop the elderly couple from being ravaged. He'd immediately started playing his healing song. It was enough to stem the bleeding and reduce the pain, but not nearly enough to close up any of the countless gory gashes that had ripped their clothes and torn their fragile skin. He had stopped playing when he realized that the injuries weren't healing, but immediately, the blood flow and agonized wailing had increased to at least the same levels they had been before, so Adian had done the only thing he could think of. He sang. His instruments gave his skills a boost, but he could activate them to a lesser degree with only his voice. So he sang to them while he had used his limited knowledge of combat healing. It wasn't something he had been taught as a child, but he had learned a few tricks from his time in the Raven militia. His impromptu patients had screamed as he tried everything he could to reduce the sanguine flow. The smell of copper, the feeling of hot blood sticking to cold hands, the wailing song of their terror and pain, those would haunt his dreams forever. After what felt like an eternity, he had managed to almost completely stop the bleeding. Mercifully, the screams had stopped as well. Unlike the tremor in his hands and the soreness in his throat, those only got worse and worse. He couldn't stop singing, though. His haphazard bandaging wasn't nearly enough by itself. He could have tried to playing one of his instruments, perhaps his flute and its special effectiveness with healing song, but Adian knew that even an improved version of his skill wasn't powerful enough to do more than stop things from getting worse. He could have kept them alive for a while longer, but unless they got help quickly, they were going to die. Adian had looked around the empty woods and knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that no one was going to happen upon them in such a remote location. So, without any other options, he had sprung into action. He had tossed all of his instruments out of his cart, and with no small amount of effort, he managed to place the moaning farmer and his wife into its rough wooden embrace. He had begun pulling the heavy load, and had immediately regretted that he hadn't invested more time into his own physical conditioning. The going was incredibly slow and unbelievably exhausting. He had never stopped singing, though. Calling the ragged sounds coming out of his mouth singing was a stretch, even as his body screamed at him to conserve his breath. He couldn't risk the bleeding starting up again. He didn't think that he would have been able to stop it. The only thing that allowed him to keep going past the limits of any normal man was that his healing song was affecting him as well as the farmers, but it was barely enough to stop his body from failing. Time dragged on, as Adian and his deathly still passengers suffered. Just when Adian thought he couldn't possibly push his body any further, the small trail he had been following merged into the larger path that led into Neridany. Hope surged in his chest at the sight of a tall figure pulling a cart along the path far in front of him. "Help, please, we need a healer," Adian croaked, but his raw, raspy voice didn't make it more than a few paces in front of him, so he coughed, cleared his throat, activated his thunderous voice skill, and once again said, "Help, please, we need a healer." The skill carried Adian's still, weak voice all the way to the figure far ahead of him. The person turned around immediately, paused for half a heartbeat, and then started running towards Adian, still pulling the cart. Adian was relieved to see that it appeared to be larger and in better shape than his own cart, which was little more than a glorified wagon. Adian stopped pulling, let out a few ragged gasps, and then picked up his violin from where it lay beside the farmers. He tried not to look at their ashen, bloodless faces or their countless oozing wounds, and once again began playing calming music while activating healing song. He let out a small prayer of thanks when he saw the figure coming towards him was a very large young man with defined muscles that were visible even under the loose clothing that he wore. He had messy brown hair and matching eyes that contained both the light of recognition and confusion at the situation. He stopped a dozen or so paces away and, after a moment's hesitation, called out above the sound of the violin. "What's going on here? Are they alive? What happened? Why in the Creator's name are you playing that instrument?" Adian replied, raising his voice so it cut through the music. There's no time for me to explain everything. I'm trying to save these people's lives. My music helps them, but it isn't enough. Please pull them into town while I keep playing. It's their only chance of survival." To his credit, the young man only hesitated for a half a moment before he pulled his cart alongside Adian's. He let out a startled shout of, "Farm wife Gladys?" when he lifted the woman, with surprising ease, between the wagons. But he didn't let the surprise slow his movements. Within a few heartbeats, the young man, with arms now covered in blood, was pulling his own cart, loaded with the injured farmers. He raced along the road with a practiced grace that Adian was hard-pressed to match, even with only his violin to contend with. After only a few moments, Adian called out, "How far away is Neridni?" "It's not far," the young man replied, his words coming easily, as if he wasn't exerting himself at all. "Okay, I'm going to switch songs and activate a skill that will increase our speed." Dre glanced quickly at the still, pale faces of the injured farmers. Then he locked eyes with Adian and gave a sharp nod. "Okay, this might feel a bit odd, but just keep on running." Adian waited for another nod, and then he switched his skill over to motivational march. His song changed as well, and he started playing an up-tempo rhythm that both men's feet snapped into without conscious effort. In what seemed like no time at all, when compared with the torture of pulling the couple himself, the two of them were within the limits of the town. The sight of the giant of a young man pulling a cart at an outrageous pace down the street cleared away most of the pedestrians. The sight of a blood-covered musician furiously playing the violin while sprinting cleared the rest. They were stopped in front of a small, pure white building, near the center of town, before Adian could even register the universal sign for healer marked in red on the front door. As soon as Adian's mind caught up with his body, he switched back to his healing song. It would hopefully ease the pain of the injured couple, who had begun groaning again when he had stopped actively healing them, but only weakly. The young man ran into the house, calling for the healer by name. It seemed like he was well connected in this small town. Unsurprising, since the stereotype that everyone knew everyone else in places like these seemed to hold true in Adian's experience. Against his will, Adian found his eyes drifting towards the injured farmers. Their bodies were covered in claw and bite marks, all of which were swollen and oozing blood slowly. Their simple clothes were now dyed a rusty crimson. The distraction of his desperate task was gone with his arrival at the healer's house. His stomach roiled as he truly comprehended the wounds for the first time. He stumbled against the cart and was forced to stop playing as a combination of nausea and lightheadedness hit him like a physical force. When he had finally regained enough wherewithal to once again observe his surroundings, he had to look away quickly so that he didn't join the young man who was retching while on his hands and knees with a mound of filth on the ground in front of him. Adian bent over and tried to stop the world as it seemed to spin around him. He averted his gaze from the boy and his stomach's content and was confronted with a short, squat woman wearing a simple white dress. She had a disapproving look carved into the wrinkles on her face. Her tone was unamused when she caught his eye and said, "If you are quite finished gawking, then please move these poor folk into my home so that I may tend to them. I can't do it on my own." The lines of her face softened as she continued, "You've done well so far, but your work is not yet over." Adian knew that she was right, so he murmured a quick prayer for strength under his breath and stood up on slightly shaky legs. A few heartbeats later, the young man wiped his mouth on the collar of his shirt and did the same. Adian waved the boy over. He grabbed under the farmer's armpits. The young man held his legs. They carried him into the White House as directed by the elderly woman. They left him on a small, clean bed in a room that contained countless dried-out plants and herbs. They hung from lines along the ceiling or were laid out along the shelves that encircled the room. The two of them repeated the process with the farm wife, after which they both stood there dumbly, staring at the healer as she wandered around the room, apparently at random, grabbing the occasional leaf, root, or herb. She glanced at Adian and asked, "Was that some sort of healing music that you were playing outside?" Her tone was polite, but Adian picked up on the frustration just beneath the first surface. His mind was still fuddled from the chaos of his afternoon, though, and he didn't understand why she could be upset with him. "Yes," Adian stated dully. The woman only glared at him, not deeming his response worthy of words. It took him a few more moments until her point finally broke through the fog in his mind. "Maybe I should go get my violin," he questioned. "I think that would be wise," she stated as she began grounding some strange-looking purple roots with a rock. "As for you, young Dre, It would be good for you to send a boy to fetch Asya for me, and then let your parents know that you are all right. Word of your bloody state may have already reached them. Adian exited the house with Dre right behind him. She is slightly terrifying, isn't she, Dre? Adian commented. Dre gave a slight smile. Yes. Thankfully, she is also terrifyingly good at healing, he said with a small chuckle. But it looked like he immediately regretted that action. His expression locked up, and his already pale face got a shade whiter. It's good that you can still laugh, Adian said, guessing at the reason for Dre's reaction. I knew men in the Raven militia who never laughed again after witnessing the aftermath of a battle. I also knew men who were frozen with shock after seeing injuries half as bad as the poor farmers. Adian grasped Dre's arm before continuing. Thank you for helping me. I was nearing the end of my endurance when I saw you. I don't think that I would have made it here in time without you. Dre rubbed his neck and gave a dismissive shrug. I just did what anyone else would have done. He hesitated for a heartbeat and then said, After I check with my parents, I will go back and get your cart from where we left it. Adian nodded as he grabbed his violin out of the back of Dre's cart. That would be most welcome. I don't know how long the healer will need me. Dre nodded and then started to turn away. He hesitated, though, and asked, You're Adian, right? You've been performing in the Fox's lair for the past few nights? Adian nodded, and Dre continued. Didn't I see that cart full of instruments when I passed you earlier? Where are those, and what happened? How did they get hurt? The last question spilled out in only a half-understandable jumble. So that was why Dre looked familiar. He must have passed him in the town, and probably had seen him in the inn's common room. Adian wasn't sure how much he should tell the young man, but he quickly decided to trust him. Dre's actions had proven him worthy of trust, after all. I need to get back in there and do what I can to help Farmer Tillman and farm wife Gladys. Dre's face fell, and Adian couldn't stop a small grin before continuing. You have earned some answers, though. The farmhouse is within some sort of infected portion of the forest, where the only living plant is some sort of moss. That portion of the forest contains a rat-gore nest, and potentially other dangerous creatures as well. As for my instruments, I left them at the farmhouse to make room in my cart. Whatever you do, don't go back for them, though. The infected creatures are dangerous, and far too smart. As soon as I get the chance, I'm going to warn the town council about it. Dre hesitated, but then nodded and turned towards the cart. Adian watched him for a moment, wondering if it had been a mistake for him to say what he did. Dre seemed to have a pretty good head on his shoulders, but young men weren't known for their wise decisions. There was no way he would try and play the hero, though, right? Adian pushed the thought out of his mind as he re-entered the healer's house and found his way back to the room with the injured couple. Just as he was about to start playing, though, Healer Norley stopped him with a question. So, what exactly does this song of yours do? I've worked with the bards with healing skills before, but the effects are always slightly different. Well, I'm actually a field musician and not a bard. Norley's frown and piercing gaze encouraged him to continue. But that doesn't matter, does it? My base ability of healing song provides a mild healing and mild pain-relieving effect to all, whom I consider allies, that can hear the song. However, one of my other abilities, called influential music, allows me to modify the effects of my bass song-type talents by altering the music that I am playing, Adian explained. As always seemed to be the case when Adian tried to explain his skills, his conversational companion looked at him blankly. So you can alter the effects of a skill with another skill? I don't know if I've heard of that before. Sort of. It's more like the skills work together. I'm always terrible at explaining this. Essentially, just think of my healing talent as a base power that builds up within me. But then I need to provide a path for that power so that I can get its effects to those around me. The song that I choose is the path. And just like different paths can approach a location from different direction, my songs can take the power of the healing song ability and slightly change how it affects people. Does that make sense? Adian asked, even though the look of utter confusion on Norley's face told him the answer. I have no idea what you are talking about. Adian let out a sigh. It was already time for oversimplification. I can play a song that does a small amount of healing and pain relief or focuses more on one or the other. The healer glared at him. Well, why in the creator's name didn't you just start with that? You're just letting these people suffer as you wax poetic. You're the one who asked me to explain my power. I was just going to immediately start playing, Adian responded, exasperation leaking into his tone against his will. Healer Norley, who had been continually mixing and mashing ingredients together during the conversation, looked up as she appeared to have finished. Just focus your song on as much healing as possible. One of my abilities increases the speed of all healing effects on my patients. It should make your song even more effective. Besides, she gestured to the concoction in her hands. This poultice includes some strong pain-relieving properties already. So, Adian began to play. He watched as the healer started with the farm wife, and applied the purple mush she had created all over the poor woman's body. She then held her hands directly over top of the woman as they began to emanate a soft golden light. Adian smiled as the swelling and redness of the injuries began to reduce at a pace that was visible to the naked eye.